The girl was bleeding, shaking, and barely able to stand when she stumbled onto the private driveway of the most feared man in Ravenport. But the words she whispered would freeze every guard in place and force a Mafia boss to make a decision that would destroy powerful men across the city. No one in that neighborhood ever approached the iron gates of Marco DeLuca's residence at night. Not unless they had a death wish or a message important enough to risk one. The estate stood at the edge of the river district, hidden behind high stone walls and security cameras that rotated slowly like watchful eyes. The kind of place where powerful businessmen arrived in black cars and left with deals no one ever discussed out loud. Marco DeLuca had just returned from a late meeting and was stepping out of his car when the motion sensor lights flickered on near the gate. At first, the guards assumed it was a stray dog or someone drunk wandering too close to the property. But then the shape moved again and became unmistakably human. A young woman staggered forward from the darkness, barefoot on the freezing pavement, her thin dress torn along one shoulder and stained with dirt and blood. She looked like someone who had been running for miles with no idea where she was going except away. The guards moved immediately, two of them approaching with the cold efficiency of men trained to remove problems quickly and quietly. But the woman collapsed before they could even reach her. Her knees hit the pavement first, then her hands, and finally she fell sideways against the cold ground with a dull sound that echoed in the quiet street. One of the guards muttered something under his breath and reached for her arm, already preparing to drag her away from the gate, when Marco DeLuca raised his hand. That single gesture stopped everyone. Marco wasn't a man who spoke unnecessarily, and his guards had learned long ago that when he made a decision without explanation, it was usually because he had already noticed something the rest of them hadn't. He stepped forward slowly, his coat brushing against the cold night air, studying the girl with the calm focus that had made him one of the most powerful men in the city's underworld. She looked barely 20, her dark hair tangled and sticking to her face, one eye swollen nearly shut, and a bruise forming along her cheekbone. Her wrists carried faint red marks that suggested someone had grabbed her hard enough to leave damage, but not long enough to leave ropes. Broken fingernails told another story, the story of someone who had clawed and fought and refused to give up even when the outcome was already decided. Marco had seen injuries like that before. They weren't the injuries of someone who had lost a fight. They were the injuries of someone who had tried very hard to win one. The girl lifted her head slowly as if every movement hurt, and for a second her clear eye met Marco's. There was fear there, but something else too: determination, calculation, the quiet awareness of someone who knew exactly whose doorstep she had chosen to collapse on. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. Instead, she whispered something so soft that Marco had to lean slightly closer to hear it. "My uncle and my boyfriend did that to me." The guards exchanged confused glances, unsure what the girl's family problems had to do with the man they worked for. But Marco didn't move. He was watching her with the still patience of someone fitting together pieces of a puzzle that had suddenly appeared in front of him. "What's your name?" he asked finally, his voice calm but impossible to ignore. The girl swallowed and winced slightly as she tried to sit up. "Lena," she said, pausing as if deciding whether the rest of the truth was worth the risk. "Lena Carter." One of the guards shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. The name Carter carried a certain reputation in Ravenport's dockyard district. Victor Carter was known as a small-time smuggler who occasionally bragged about connections he didn't really have. The kind of man who survived by attaching himself to bigger players and pretending to be more important than he actually was. Marco knew the type well. Men like Victor Carter borrowed power the way other people borrowed money, always promising they would return it later. "Tell me what happened," Marco said. Lena's breathing was uneven, and for a moment it seemed like she might pass out before she could answer. But she forced herself to stay conscious, gripping the pavement as if the ground itself was the only thing keeping her from disappearing. "My uncle owed money," she said slowly. "A lot of money. To a man named Rafael Costa." That name meant something too. Costa ran a network that dealt in things most people preferred not to think about: drugs, illegal shipments, and sometimes people. Marco's expression remained neutral, but his attention sharpened. "And your boyfriend?" Marco asked. Lena laughed once, a broken sound that didn't contain any humor. "He helped my uncle," she said. "They told me the debt was too big to repay." She hesitated, the words clearly heavier than the bruises covering her face. So they made a deal instead. Marco already knew the answer before she finished speaking. He had spent too many years in the city's criminal world not to recognize the pattern. But he waited anyway, because sometimes the truth carried more weight when the person who suffered it was the one forced to say it aloud. Lena closed her eyes briefly, gathering enough strength to finish the sentence. "They sold me to Costa," she whispered. The night seemed to grow colder. One of the guards cursed quietly under his breath, but Marco ignored him. He was studying Lena with the careful attention of a man who understood that this situation had just become far more complicated than a wounded girl appearing at his gate. "Why come here?" he asked. Lena opened her eyes again. "Because they said you approved it," she answered. That was the moment everything changed. Marco DeLuca had spent years building a reputation so powerful that entire criminal organizations avoided conflict with him simply to stay alive. His name carried weight in every part of the city, from the waterfront to the financial district. It was a currency of fear and respect that couldn't be bought or stolen. Except someone had just tried to do exactly that. Lena watched his reaction carefully, clearly expecting anger or disbelief, but Marco simply stood there thinking. After a long silence, he spoke again, his voice quieter than before, but somehow even more dangerous. "They used my name," he said slowly, as if confirming a detail that would matter later. Lena nodded. "My uncle told Costa the deal had your blessing," she said. Marco turned toward his guards. "Bring her inside," he ordered. The men hesitated for only a second before moving forward carefully, lifting Lena to her feet. As they carried her toward the gate, Marco remained standing in the cold night air, his thoughts already moving several steps ahead. Somewhere in the city, two men believed they had solved their financial problem by selling a young woman and borrowing the reputation of the most dangerous man in Ravenport. They had no idea that the girl they had tried to discard had just delivered their confession directly to him. And Marco DeLuca, a man known for many things, but forgiveness rarely being one of them, was already beginning to plan what would happen next. By the time morning arrived in Ravenport, Lena Carter was no longer the girl bleeding at the gate of Marco DeLuca's estate. She was sitting in a quiet guest room on the second floor of his townhouse, her wrist wrapped in a brace and a blanket around her shoulders, while pale winter light filtered through the tall window. The doctor Marco had called before sunrise had treated her injuries quickly and without questions: bruised ribs, a fractured wrist, and a concussion that would fade with rest. In houses like Marco DeLuca's, professionals understood that curiosity was rarely rewarded. After the doctor left, the house returned to a careful silence. Downstairs, Marco sat in his office while his lieutenant, Antonio Rivas, laid out everything they had already learned about the situation. Victor Carter, Lena's uncle, was a dockyard smuggler with a growing list of debts and a reputation for borrowing more power than he actually possessed. The debt to Rafael Costa was real, over $300,000 owed after a smuggling operation had collapsed. Costa, unlike Victor, was far more dangerous. He ran trafficking routes through the southern docks and had built his reputation on making examples of people who failed him. The part that mattered most, however, was something Antonio read from the report with careful emphasis. Victor told Costa the arrangement had your approval. Marco leaned back in his chair, his expression unchanged but his attention sharpening. Costa believed him, he asked. Antonio nodded slightly. Your name carries weight. If someone says you guaranteed a deal, most people don't question it. Marco said nothing for a moment. A reputation like his functioned as a kind of currency in the criminal world. Victor Carter had spent it like counterfeit money, attaching Marco's authority to a deal that involved selling his own niece. That lie was now circulating in the same circles where Marco's power depended on precision. Upstairs, Lena was still staring at the city when a knock came at the door. Marco stepped inside a moment later, carrying a cup of tea that he set beside her chair before sitting across from her. For several seconds the room stayed quiet. The doctor says your injuries will heal, he said calmly. Lena nodded. Thank you, she replied softly. Marco folded his hands. Now tell me everything. She explained how the debt had grown over months, how her uncle had promised it would disappear after one last job, and how everything collapsed when the shipment was seized. Costa demanded repayment immediately, knowing Victor didn't have the money. At first her uncle panicked. Then Lena's boyfriend, Dylan, suggested the solution that changed everything. If they told Costa the arrangement had Marco DeLuca's approval, The trafficker wouldn't question it. They said no one would challenge your name, Lena said quietly. And if I refused, they'd make sure I couldn't run. Marco listened without interrupting. When she finished, he stood and walked toward the window, looking out at the cold streets of the city. You think I'm going to kill them, he said after a moment. Lena hesitated. Aren't you? Marco shook his head slowly. No, she frowned slightly. Then what? Marco turned back toward her. His voice was calm, but there was something colder behind it. I'm going to ruin them. Killing Victor Carter would end one problem. Ruining him would end every problem he could ever cause again. Over the next day, Marco began making calls. Not threats, arrangements. A financial investigator suddenly began auditing Victor's dockyard businesses. A journalist received documents linking Rafael Costa to trafficking operations. A federal prosecutor quietly received information about illegal shipments moving through the port. None of it involved violence, but each step tightened the walls around the two men who had believed they could hide behind Marco DeLuca's name. By the following evening, the consequences had already started. Victor's warehouses were flagged for inspection. Costa's bank transfers were frozen. Rumors spread quickly through the city's criminal network that both men had made a catastrophic mistake. And upstairs in the quiet guest room, Lena Carter slowly began to understand something important. Marco DeLuca didn't need to hunt his enemies down. He simply changed the rules of the world around them, until there was nowhere left for them to stand. 3 weeks later, Victor Carter finally understood how badly he had miscalculated. By then the city had already turned against him. His warehouses were closed under investigation, his accounts were frozen, and the few criminal contacts who used to answer his calls had suddenly forgotten his name. Rafael Costa fared even worse. The evidence that had quietly reached federal investigators triggered a series of raids along the southern docks, and Costa was arrested before he could leave the country. The man who once terrified half the port now sat in a holding cell waiting for charges that would likely keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. Victor, desperate and exhausted, eventually agreed to meet Marco DeLuca in a small private room above an old restaurant in the garment district. When he walked in, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a month. Marco was already seated at the table, calm as always, while his attorney placed a document in front of Victor. You used my name to sell your niece, Marco said quietly. Victor tried to defend himself at first, claiming it had only been a lie to calm Costa down, that he never meant for the situation to spiral out of control. Marco let him talk until the excuses ran out. Then he slid the document closer. It was an affidavit admitting exactly what had happened and confirming that Marco had never approved the arrangement. If Victor signed it, he might receive some leniency when the investigations concluded. If he refused, the remaining evidence Marco possessed would appear in the hands of prosecutors by morning. Victor stared at the paper for a long time before finally picking up the pen. When he signed his name, his hands were shaking. Months later, the results were final. Rafael Costa was convicted of trafficking and smuggling charges. Victor Carter was sentenced as part of the same case after cooperating with investigators. His son Dylan faced charges of his own. The story spread through Ravenport's news channels and newspapers, not because of Marco DeLuca, whose involvement remained mostly invisible, but because the case exposed a trafficking network operating inside the city for years. Meanwhile, Lena Carter remained in Marco's house, while she rebuilt the pieces of a life that had nearly been taken from her. Her wrist healed slowly, the bruises faded, and the quiet routine of the townhouse began to feel less like a hiding place and more like safety. One evening, she found Marco standing in the courtyard watching the sunset settle over the rooftops. It's over, she said. Marco nodded slightly. Yes. Lena studied him for a moment before asking the question she had carried since the night she arrived at his gate. Why did you help me? Marco looked out at the city for a long moment before answering. Because when you came to my gate, you didn't beg, he said. You told the truth. Lena was quiet, thinking about that. In the world Marco lived in, truth was rare and power was often used to take things from people weaker than you. But that night he had used his power differently. He had given it back. For the first time since everything had happened, Lena felt something she hadn't felt in months, control over her own future. And Marco DeLuca, the man many believed ruled Ravenport through fear alone, understood something else as well. Sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do wasn't destroying their enemies. Sometimes it was making sure the truth was strong enough to destroy them instead.